Have you ever watched something and it just settles in your bones? Welcome to Lamp, I'm Oz. Today we are talking about Archive 81, which came out last year on January 14th and subsequently was canceled 2 months later. Netflix, I'm coming for your ass. Archive 81 was produced and written by Rebecca Shonnenshine and was starred Mamoudou, Athie, and Dina, Shihabi. The main character, Dan, who's played by Mamoudou, is an archivist and restores tapes, like old tapes, like VHS and like, the little tapey things. One day he goes into work, he gets a special project. It's just this random tape that seemingly was destroyed in a fire. After he restores it, he watches it, and these two innocuous young women are talking about...
Look around and we're all texting.
These two innocuous young women named Melody and Annabelle are talking about Melody's new research project. It doesn't seem to mean anything. In fact, it just kind of seems strangely like every day. There's nothing weird about it. Until we meet the film's owner. Virgil Davenport, played by Martin Donovan, is the CEO of a strange company just called LMG, which we never get to know what that stands for or what exactly the company does. So after restoring the tape and meeting Mr. Davenport, he is offered a job to go ahead and restore and digitize the rest of the collection. Now, he's not entirely convinced at first to do the job until he notices something strange in the background. So Annabelle's, I think, the one holding the camera in the scene, and we're looking at the mirror of the two girls. And on the mirror, there's a photo of Melody with a golden retriever. Seems like a normal everyday picture. You wouldn't think anything of it. But the golden retriever has a red collar. And Dan is convinced that this was his dog from childhood. Now, it could just be any dog, but for whatever reason, he's completely convinced himself that there's a connection here. There's something he needs to find out more. And despite his best friend, Mark, played by Matt McGorry, trying to talk him out of it, or at least being like, hey man, that's kind of weird. I mean, it could be anyone's dog. Dan takes the job and goes out to an isolated location in the middle of nowhere with no car, no cell phone signal, and it's super weird and creepy. So he starts to digitize these tapes, right? The first tape he puts in, we end up seeing his dad. And then it starts to reveal the whole truth of the situation. So when Dan was young, his house burnt down, killing his entire family, including his mom, his dad, and his younger sister, or his sister, I don't know, which resulted in his PTSD and his later subsequent mental health breakdown. So immediately the show establishes that Dan has a history with mental health issues and is currently taking some sort of pill, which is possibly anti-anxiety or antipsychotics. We're not sure. There is a scene where it shows the bottle. I didn't get to see the name of the drug, so I don't know what it was. But as we watch the tapes, we start to learn that Melody, who was originally going to this building called the Visser to do a research project, is kind of there for a different reason. Yes, she is doing the research project and she's going around interviewing all the people who live in the building to learn more about its history, but she's also searching for her mom, Julia Bennett. She starts to realize pretty early on that something's not quite right in this building. The first person she meets is Jess, a young Black woman who goes around doing different chores and projects for people, and they give her a little bit of money on the side. So she's essentially becomes a sort of messenger character who can connect Melody with these different people to do interviews and shares information that she has gathered. And she sort of has more information than she should as a young girl. So as the story evolves, we start to notice some weird things that are happening at the Visser. At first, it's just this weird chanting, this strange music that she hears coming up through the vents. And then she realizes that same music is being written into an opera by one of the people that live at the Visser. Her name is Tamara. Now, Tamara is a really strange character. She's like, Melody comes out straight and asks her, like, oh, I think I heard you making music last night because I heard this song. She's like, no, it wasn't me. I wasn't here. I was doing background stuff for my opera that's going on or whatever. And she's very secretive and not giving away a lot of things. And we were like, okay, that's kind of strange. Ghost music, maybe? Yeah, all right, that's fun. But then it later evolves into cult activity. Always fun. We love a good cult. Melody in her search for answers, ends up going down to the community room when she hears the singing again. And she witnesses something that we're probably not supposed to see. She sees everyone from the building who's sitting in these chairs together, looking at this cabinet with a stone statue. And they're all singing in unison the same strange song that Tamara was playing, that was coming up through the vents, and that just keeps coming up. At the end, they're all huffing in sync together, and then it all goes quiet. And then they all get up, and they hug, and they say goodbye as if it was just a totally normal event. Just, we're just buds hanging out, huffing together. And then she goes to try to explore. She tries to look into the cabinet, but she hears people coming back. So she hides in the closet and witnesses Samuel and Tamara doing some stanky nasty. Which I did forget to say that Samuel was flirting with Melody, and definitely he's a very charming character. He's definitely like very manipulative and in charge of something. Like you can see immediately he's very sneaky and he's up to something. Definitely up to something, because he keeps getting mentioned and brought up. Like when we first meet Jess, Melody shows some concern for her. She's like, "Oh, did Samuel send you?" And she's like, "Who is Samuel?" And she's like, "Oh, never mind." So we immediately know something's up with Samuel. He's some sort of like, he's kind of like the brains of the operation. What operation? We don't know yet. So as Dan is watching these videos, he's starting to encounter some strange events. He thinks that he's seeing a face in the screen. He starts to have strange dreams where he's talking to Melody. There's only one interaction with the other people, someone else, which is Cassandra. And I'll get back to that later, maybe if I remember. So then we also realize that the dreams that he's having are having an effect on the film. So we are seeing the conversations they're having are sort of being respoken or interacted in the film. Like, for example, at some point, Dan says to Melody, "Oh, like it's not a feature. It's a feature, not a bug," talking about like her concern and the way, like her personality. And she later reiterates that idea to her friend Annabelle. And, at first you can be like, "Oh, whatever, it's just a phrase." Like, you can kind of discount it. But then as it goes on, it becomes more and more credible and more like you have to believe that something strange is going on. So I kind of just want to jump to the end. Because so much happens in the show, and like I definitely go watch it. Like there's going to be spoilers in this video. I'm going to spoil the end because I want to talk about what it all means. As Dan is staying in this compound, isolated out in the middle of nowhere, there's literally a fence with wire up at the top, like keeping him in. He has to like go all the way out to the edge of the fence to even get some cell signal, and he keeps trying to call to his friend Mark to get Mark to do research for him to find out what is going on in this compound and like how real it was. But a lot of the names that he's giving him aren't coming back. Like they can't find information. There's nothing on LMG. They don't understand. We find out that Dr. Turner was, there was a complaint filed against him. They can't figure out why. And basically all of the answers are in this compound. Dan ends up knocking on the back of a pantry and realizes that it's hollow and there's something down there. There's something more to this building. And he ends up breaking it down with this big wrench, which keeps coming back. We love the big wrench. And he goes down and he finds this like chapel, and he finds all these hallways and all these other VHS tapes and files and rooms that are locked he can't get into. And this is when we learn that there's cameras all over this facility and that he's constantly being monitored. Virgil goes to visit him and he's like, "Hey, let's not go down there. No. And he's still acting very like, "I'm just your boss. Nothing's wrong." And he keeps feeding him lie after lie that just barely pacifies Dan for long enough. But eventually we realize that Virgil's lying. He's lying about absolutely everything. He's trying to get Dan to like find some sort of secret that he's not willing to find himself. And so Dan will rewires the cameras so that it just shows a blank feed of the hallway so he can go down there and try to guess the codes. And that's not working, and he's getting frustrated. But then in one of his dreams with Melody, she's in one of the other bedrooms of this compound, and she finds this notebook. She's reading it. She's like, "Hey, did you write these?" And he's like, "No, I didn't write those." And she's like, "Well, it's just like soap operas, like just, the plots of soap operas." He's like, "Well, that's weird." And they just kind of laugh it off. And then eventually she gets upset about something, and the lights flicker, very ghostly. She vanishes, and we're like, "Oh, maybe she is just a ghost." It's very, very ghosty stuff. And then he finds this whole wardrobe of these journals, and every single journal has T bellows in the back of it. So we know that all of them were written by the same person. And most of them are just plots of soap operas, which seems very strange, but it doesn't seem to have any meaning until he finally finds the code to the door in the basement. And then when he goes into that basement, we eventually find a bunch, like an archive of the stuff that was at the Visser. We find Melody's stuff, like her necklace, her notebook. We find all these files on like people who live there, and you're starting to be like, something's not right here. Why is Virgil obsessed with the Visser? Finally, we start to realize like what is really going on. And the compound was built on top of the Visser, which was built on top of the Voss mansion, which is important because we have this repeated image of a circle. We see it in the very beginning when Dan is trying to fix up this film that he gets from Evie Crest, who he doesn't know, she just offers him money to fix up this film. It's called The Circle, and apparently it's like based on a snuff film, and it's this whole ritual. It's really weird and all this stuff, but it doesn't seem to mean anything in the beginning. And of course it means everything by the end, but there's this like continuation of like circle metaphors that happen, this very like cyclical thing. So it's like the rebuilding on the compound, and then the destruction, and then the rebuilding and the destruction. This like very cyclical plot telling. As we discover this, we start to discover, we get to like the main point with Melody. And I really like episode 5 and 6 because we're sort of switching perspectives from Dan to Melody. And we still know that we're watching from Dan's perspective because by the end, like we'll see like Dan behind the screen. So we still only know as much as she recorded and not really much else, which is great because she recorded a lot. So we start to realize that there's this mold in the building that is essentially causing people to hallucinate or have delusions. And so kind of everyone becomes untrustworthy by the end. But then we witness, not only do we witness, but we see that it's on camera, it's been caught on camera, that they do the ritual. We see Iris Voss do the ritual, and then we later see Samuel do the ritual, and this sort of like creepy blue cloud comes down and like basically sucks everybody up, and then somehow causes a fire and destroys everything. That was never clear, which I think is interesting because we only actually physically see the fire at Dan's house. We never actually see the fire at the Visser or see the fire at the Voss house. So it sort of feels like maybe that's not what happened, or it feels like there's something there that they're not telling us. Anyway, so we get to the end. Samuel does the ritual. He forces Melody to be a part of it. They summon this god demon, Kalego, who they think is omniscient and can grant them like miracles or will essentially save the world. Iris keeps saying that like it's going to solve famine and war and all of these issues. Samuel doesn't really express what it is he wants. I think he just wants like power and control. So we see all of them basically vanish with the film. And in that last episode, it's in Jess's perspective because she also like at some point gets a camera and wants to be a filmmaker. So it's in this like really deteriorated black and white film. But I think it's fascinating that we go from Dan's perspective to Melody's perspective on the camera to Jess's perspective on the camera. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So everyone disappears. And then Dan has finished his work. He wakes up in his home after he's been knocked unconscious, and because he went down and found the ritual room, and all the videos are like replaying in that room. So it's just this like cycle of the videos. So again, we have this idea of like the circle, the cycle. He wakes up in his apartment and he goes to talk to Virgil, and he's like, everything's done here. Like we're finished. Also, you destroyed a lot of our property. So either leave me alone, leave this whole situation alone, stop asking questions, or I'm gonna like press charges. Immediately we're like, Dan, you should really let it go. And he's not gonna let it go because he's made this connection with Melody that he can't give up on. So he comes back to his apartment, and Mark is there, and Mark has essentially found like, after doing all this research for him this whole time, he's found like the big thing. He found the snuff film. He found all the films that were sold in just like a random, one of those sales. I don't know. Rich people shit. So it all comes together. All this knowledge is coming together. We're finally realizing that everything that Dan was experiencing is real, and that they can possibly save Melody. So they go back to the compound. They face down with Virgil, who points a gun at Dan, and then of course Dan is saved by Mark, who smacks him in the back of the head with, I think, the big wrench. I think the big wrench made a comeback. They go down to the ritual room, and Dan is absolutely convinced that he can save Melody. He wants to go down there. He wants to like open the door. He's not going to do the ritual. He just wants to open the door. And this is when we realize that Mark like has been a true friend the whole time. He's like, dude, I don't want you to die. Like, I don't want you to get hurt, but I'm not going to leave you here. Like, if you're convinced that you have to do this, I'm going to do it with you. I'm going to help you out. So they go in there, and then I don't know if I mentioned Bobby at all. I really should have. But Bobby is essentially the caretaker of the compound, or that's what she calls herself. And we find out in this scene that the reason she's sticking around is because she's Melody's mom, and she thought that if she gave Melody up, that she would not have to be a part of the bloodline of the Baldung, which is like this coven of witches, and she wouldn't have to deal with all of this shit with Kalego. She was wrong, obviously. So Bobby is like, listen, I want my daughter back. I know you want the same thing. You want her to come back so we can help each other. I can hold this open for like 5 minutes, and that's all you've got. So he goes in, Dan goes in, he sees his family, and he's tempted by this image that Kalego creates of his family, of having like being able to relive his family life as it should have been. And then he's like, no, I cannot be swayed, and goes and finds Melody. And then essentially at the end, Melody gets grabbed and is pulled back through the portal, and Dan is not. Now we're still in the same situation where someone is stuck in the other world, but someone, you know, we've sort of traded places, which seems to be the price that we have to pay anyway, because that keeps happening. Okay, so there's your synopsis. I'm sorry it took 20 fucking minutes. Now I just want to talk about why I think this show is so fucking good. All right, so now we have our synopsis. You generally understand what happened in the story, and obviously there's a lot more that happened as a like mystery horror. There's a lot of like prestige that happens, a lot of like slow revealing. Highly recommend just watching it. Because I was very compelled by the story. Like, I just was on the edge of my seat the whole time. But now I want to talk about what elements they used to make it so compelling. So first and foremost, we have the lens with which we view the story. So it's sort of like 3 parts removed. So we are watching Dan, watching Melody, who's recording what's going on, trying to figure out what's going on. So essentially, we have 3 unreliable narrators. The narrator, like the lens that is the camera, which it can only capture so much. We'll never get the whole story. And then we have Melody, who has a history of mental illness as established by her visits with the psychiatrist. And also she gets taken away at basically at the end to not a mental health hospital. So we are being told not to trust her. And then we also see Dan as having a history with mental health. We see this we were told frequently that he had a mental break in his past. He's taking his medication, which could be an anti-anxiety or could be antipsychotic. Virgil is constantly asking him if he's having a mental health emergency and if he needs help, which is a form of gaslighting, by the way. It's all he's ever doing. He's like, oh, are you okay? Even though he knows what's going on. So essentially we have like 3 parts removed, unreliable narrator. We don't know what to believe, what to see as truth, until it is corroborated by other characters or by evidence. Now, as a white person, I do not get to be the mouthpiece for POC or Black people, but I do get to talk about whiteness. So I want to talk about what I saw with the whiteness in this show. Firstly, we have Virgil Davenport, who is hiring Dan to do this project for him, putting him in an isolation and viewing from a distance. So we see that there are cameras all over this compound. I mean, everywhere. He's watching everything that Dan does. So we know that Virgil is aware of the danger of this situation. We know that he knows what Samuel was up to. We just don't know to what extent or what his goals are. So he has distanced himself from the danger and put a Black body as a shield between him and that danger. But the whole time, he is still supervising Dan. So he's constantly watching. He's like hovering over him. As it's mentioned at some point, Dan feels like he's in a fishbowl. So that feels very important. It feels like it's, this conversation of how whiteness will protect itself, how it's like constantly supervising the other. It's sort of this, Virgil is very much a businessman. At one point he approaches Mark and asks him what he's getting out of his friendship with Dan. And we realize that Virgil is not a genuine person. He's very much standoffish. He doesn't understand true connection with people. He doesn't even seem to be loving at any point. We even find out at the end that he's oh, I don't care that Samuel is trapped in this other world. He did that to himself. He doesn't even have familial connection. So he treats everything like a business partnership. So he's what are you getting out of this relationship? Which makes us think, what is Virgil getting out of this? What is his goal? And then you also think, what does Kalego get out of his relationship with his worshippers? So it just opens up all these questions that we don't get an answer to, but leads us to think about it more. But in this conversation of whiteness, for a while I thought Dina, who plays Melody, was also white. But looking into her background, she's actually from Saudi Arabia. So I started to realize that all of these main characters are people of color. Even Annabelle is played by Julia Chan, who is part Chinese and part Canadian. And then I wasn't able to find, I didn't try very hard, but the guy that plays Samuel, who has many other aliases, is played by Evan Johnigkeit? Sounds German. I don't know. He was born in Pennsylvania. Very much looks like a white dude and does not seem to be claiming anything other than whiteness. So we're just gonna go with white for now. Fucking stupid. But we see this interplay between Samuel as this sort of mastermind behind this whole convoluted situation. We find out that he sent the letter to Melody, pretending it was from her mom, to seduce her into coming to the Visser so that he could use her as a battery, basically. So Samuel and Virgil are both doing the same thing with using the black and brown body as a vehicle to get what they desire. And this theme keeps repeating itself because Jess, who is a young black woman, is also being manipulated and used by Cassandra and Samuel to become the next vessel. Essentially, they've convinced her that she's helping them, that she's going to contain worlds, which is another idea that's repeated, and that she's bound for greatness in some way. And of course, she's very young, so she's very easy to manipulate. She's very gullible, and she's been working for all these people, so she feels a friendship, a kinship with them, especially Samuel, who seemingly saved her from her mom and Father Rousseau, which is another conversation on whiteness, because Father Rousseau is also a brown man, played by Martin Sola, who is Puerto Rican. Father Rousseau is the Catholic priest, and he is trying to heal Jess through the power of God. Which is, of course, a very uncomfortable thing to witness, because you're no, she needs a real doctor, but also you can see that they want the best for Jess, but they don't know how to go about it. They're using the tools they have, but it's obviously hurting her more. So at first you're on Samuel's side because he stepped in between that, and he's no, she needs a real doctor, and you're yeah, she needs a real doctor. But you start to realize that he's just trying to make himself out to be better, making himself look better to Jess. And manipulating her into seeing her mom and Father Rousseau as bad people. And I think there's this, I don't know what the intended conversation was with the Christianity, but I kept seeing parallels between the Catholic ideology and the ideology of Kalego. Before I get to that, let me finish my conversation on whiteness, 'cause we're still in the middle of that. So Father Rousseau is this brown man who is seemingly trying to help, but is hurting. And so Samuel, the white man, is stepping in as a sort of white savior figure, which I don't even saying that. So he's stepping in and seemingly saving Jess from this medieval savage behavior, which is absolutely a conversation on race, because the way we are perceiving it through the lens of Dan and Melody is that we're also kind of convinced that Sam is a sort of savior. Now, I don't really want to get in the conversation of how colonialism has caused a lot of cultural genocide and how Christianity has kind of like taken over the cultures of POC. I don't feel like that's my place, but I do think that conversation is happening there too. And I think, maybe someone else can take that on. But I'm gonna move on. So yeah, we start to see Samuel as a sort of white savior figure, as he's very dubious. You can't quite tell if he means well or not. He seems to genuinely apologize when he's done wrong. And he also becomes this symbol of a key. Every time Melody is trying to like sneak into something, do something she's not supposed to, he always shows up with like a skeleton key. So he becomes like unanimous with, that's not the right word. He sort of becomes this image of a skeleton key, which is super ironic because by the end we realize that they didn't have the correct key to open the door to the other world. So he thinks that he has all this knowledge. He thinks that he's like essentially omniscient in his own way. And yet he fumbles it because he thinks he's the key and he's not the key. But what I do think is interesting is that this idea of Melody and Dan being unreliable narrators is pushed by Virgil and Samuel. They keep bringing it up. Virgil keeps asking Dan if he's having a mental health emergency. He tries to convince Mark that like he's unwell and he needs help. Same thing with Samuel. He's always like gaslighting Melody, being like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. What mold? We learn to mistrust the POC characters through the white people. And then later on, they are corroborated. Melody and Dan are corroborated through white people. Because when we meet Thomas Bellows, who also has like a video of himself in this place and he's like losing it. And he starts seeing things on the TV. So he's having the same experiences as Dan. So essentially, Dan becomes not crazy because the white man is experiencing the same symptoms.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
Okay, so now that I've kind of established this relationship to whiteness that is happening in the show, I kind of want to talk more about the Catholic faith versus this worship of Kalego. So we have this image of Kalego as a stone statue, and it comes out in the TV screens and we see it in photos, and it seems to exist without space and time, or perhaps in a space and time that we can't understand. And it kind of is a parallel universe, but it's not. We're not really exactly sure what's happening, but we do see the way that God becomes a comfort through ignorance with a lot of the characters. So when we go back to the 20s with Iris Voss, she starts to talk about it like, isn't my worship enough to she wants to have a baby. She thinks that like worshiping Kalego will create this miracle and she can have a child. She also keeps mentioning how it'll solve the world's problems. It's going to save the people. It's going to release people. And it kind of sounds like the second coming of Christ, where everyone will be reunited in this sort of death or this other world. Because that she keeps bringing that up. She convinces Rose to join them by saying, don't you want to see your family again? Which is of course a Christian ideology of seeing your family in heaven. Except for there's not this dichotomy of heaven and hell. It's just the other world. There's just this one land of the dead. So yeah, it kind of becomes this perversion of Christianity, but it's not different. It's not the opposite. It's still a very similar ideology. And we see that with when they talk about the mold being his body and his blood, and they're consuming it, the Eucharist basically. But what I see in this metaphor is that it's a very ignorant and nearsighted attempt at a solution. So instead of actually facing the troubles of humanity and trying to find a solution through science or through conversation, they're just oh, what if I just fix it with this cure-all, this magical supernatural cure-all? God will come down and just fix everything. Which of course is very ignorant and dangerous point of view, which I think is the whole message they're trying to make with colonialism and God, and basically all these white people coming into other cultures and stripping them of their culture in the name of saving them. I'm just saying, I'm seeing some connections here. The queerness. So I want to talk about how queerness is represented in this show. and how it's an interesting conversation. So Cassandra, who seems to be Samuel's like right-hand man, like she's very much not afraid of using other people for her own ends, especially like we have the dinner party / seance scene where she's like, oh, Beatrice is a very skilled medium. Why don't we try to contact your father? And it's Evie Crest is there, and they're trying to like figure out where the snuff film is. And she's very obvious, like she's not trying to hide that that's what she wants from Evie. She's like, oh, ask him about the film. And then she's again, white lady Cassandra using the body of a brown woman, Beatrice, for her own ends. And of course, she convinces Melody to do the same thing. So there's sort of, again, there's this conversation of like, because I thought that Melody was white. So there's sort of this proximity to whiteness where she's like trying to convince Melody to like join her side, basically. And she does ask Beatrice about her mom, and like, you know, she doesn't connect with her mom because her mom's not dead. Foreshadowing. And then Beatrice starts to see these dreams that Melody is happening. And again, that's like this corroboration of them not being crazy. I don't like to use that word because it's just insulting. And then Beatrice obviously sees, I don't know if it's Beatrice or Beatrice, so I'm sorry if I keep going back and forth, sees something that she's not supposed to, and she starts like tearing at her face. We can assume that it's Kalego because what else would it be? We also, like, later at the hospital, we have that scene where Melody's like, well, can you just look one more time? And like she's like almost getting seduced into like abusing her power over this woman. And of course Beatrice is like, no. Okay, I want to talk about some little details that I just found really interesting. Obviously, as someone who is restoring film, Dan is really invested in movies and media. So we get a bunch of these little, like, they're kind of like Easter eggs. At one point, he pulls out Solaris and he starts watching that. And I haven't seen the movie, but I have read the book. So spoiler alert for Solaris. It's about these astronauts who go to a water planet, and they end up finding out that the planet is sentient and can create doppelgangers of people they've known based on their memories. So it's, obviously it's not the real people. It's just like this planet trying to not become human, but sort of achieve humanness in a way. But it ends up just driving everyone insane. But that just brings in this concept of like doppelgangers. If there's a parallel world, is there also like parallel versions of the self? When Dan wakes up and it's like, I think it was the 60s or the 70s, it's on the TV, and I like looked away for a second and didn't see it and then didn't rewind because I don't know, whatever, just having a day. He wakes up in a hospital and he's been told he's been in a coma for 10 days, and he looks out the window and it's like old-timey New York. But there's this telltale sign that every time he's sort of in this, like, he's in between the other world and our world, there's like these little floaty, glowy bits, kind of like if you've seen Stranger Things, they have the little floaty bits, which I think one of the producers did some of this show from Stranger Things, did part of the show. So I just think it's, so when he wakes up from the coma and he's like, what year is it? We don't see the telltale sparkly bits. Was he just like spit out as another version of himself in another timeline? Or like, is he still in the other world? Like, and this is why I'm so mad that Netflix canceled it, because now we'll never know. We never know. So anyway, if you watch this and you're like, this show is amazing, let's just all yell at Netflix to see if they'll bring it back. Because like Netflix keeps doing this thing where they're like canceling shows. It seems to have a pattern of either like a black lead or a queer lead or both. Because they did the same thing with First Kill, which admittedly was not a great show. Like, it was not well made, the budget was bad, but it was a lot of fun and I really enjoyed watching it, and I would have loved a season 2. Anyway, I said I was going to talk about queerness and they didn't. So Cassandra is gay, and like at first we don't really know that unless you're viewing through the queer lens, because she keeps talking about my Eleanor, and she calls her sister, but then like Eleanor was painting like basically nude photos of her, so we're like, I don't know if that's your sister. And then it's revealed through Annabelle, who has been very outwardly queer this entire time, that it was just, it was a ruse. They were lovers, and they took each other's last name, or one of them took the last name to like sort of make it seem like they were sisters, so they could be gay in what was probably the 60s. And then also like we see Annabelle as like, she's always talking about how like beautiful women are. She's very like openly queer, which is really cool to see like that generational difference, like how Cassandra had to hide her love, but Annabelle gets to kind of be freer with it, which is really nice. And at first I was kind of nervous. I thought they were gonna like try to make a message out of that. Try to say like, oh, Cassandra's like an evil lesbian and Annabelle was like seduced by her. But I don't think that was it at all. Like at the end of the day, I just think that like the queerness was just casually in there, and it was sort of to show that the difference in time. Because like basically this whole show is about this mirroring of time and space. So yes, I think it's important that we see Annabelle sort of she's not really getting seduced because she's poisoned by the mold in the paint that Eleanor used to like see the other world. So really she's like not in control of herself. So I don't think that was a narrative. I don't think they were trying to say like they were trying to use the like psychotic lesbian thing. I think they were genuinely just trying to be like a casual queerness and like talking about how times have changed. But speaking of time, they do a really interesting thing with that with the camera, because they keep mentioning how the camera can capture things that we can't see with our eyes. So the camera like captures the demon. So Kalego is like in there, captured in this sort of timelessness and this spacelessness because it's on camera, which is eternal in a way. Like obviously it can be destroyed. It was almost destroyed. But then it was restored by Dan. So there's still this sort of like, as he's watching it, this simultaneousness of time, like it seems to be happening to them both at the same time, even though we know that Melody's story was in the past. So I think that's just a really fascinating take on like time and space and how it can work differently in a parallel world. Yes, the rats. I want to talk about the rats. So another one of those little Easter eggs that I saw was The Secrets of Nimh. Now, I've never seen The Secrets of Nimh. I did, however, see An American Tail, which was directed by Disney's creepy uncle, Don Bluth. But both of these, I think they exist in the same universe. They're about like mice families. And American Tail is really creepy and actually scared me as a kid. There's like this mouse. No, there was a rat in the suit. I don't know why, he really scared me as a kid. Anyway, The Secrets of Nimh is essentially about this one mouse who is a mother. She's trying to take care of her sick child. She ends up needing the help of these rats. And it turns out that Nimh is the National Institute of Mental Health. And the rats were experimented on in there. And so now they're intelligent and they can't live without human technology. And we find out that Nimh is going to eradicate the rats, wants to kill them, and so now they all have to escape. So that is a really interesting parallel to this situation, because as we've mentioned, Dan is trapped in this compound and he ends up finding a rat that's like living in the cabinet, and he he puts out traps for it and it snaps down on its tail. So it doesn't kill it, but does hurt it. So he's like, this is my rat friend now. His name is Ratty and he lives in a box, which is just adorable. But there's this parallel of him sort of being this rat trapped in a cage. Virgil is like experimenting on him as if he were subhuman and like using him for his own experimental needs. Sorry, the hair just flew in my nose. So I just really like that parallel and that play with like this idea of Dan treats the rat like a friend. He's just like, you can do whatever you want. And at one point he's like chewing on wires. He's like, don't eat that. But he doesn't actually stop him. So he's very much like humanizes this rat as his only friend in this compound, while at the same time he is being dehumanized. So it's a nice little interplay. I like that. I'm almost done ranting, I swear. It was really fun watch, and it was a lot to like think about. I actually just like took notes while I was watching because I am a normal person who likes things a normal amount. So anyway, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of like fire that's happening. So the only fire that we visually see is at Dan's house when he, witnesses it. But of course, that's because we're witnessing this entire thing through Dan and Melody's perspective. And because neither of them saw the fires at the Visser or at the Voss house. Neither do we. But that also like gives us space to believe that maybe there wasn't a fire, or maybe something else happened. Now, the explanation for the fire at Dan's house is that there was a group. So there's the group that worships Kalego, and then there's another group that, sorry, I just punched the mic. There's another group that wants to completely eradicate any evidence of Kalego so that he can like never be brought back. However, that group is the ones that burned down Dan's house and ended up killing this family just to destroy evidence. And they didn't even do it. So you start to realize that even though they have two opposing ideologies, and you kind of empathize more with those who are like, no, let's not invite Kalego back to the world. Their means are just as destructive as the worshippers. So they're killing just as much. And so like the outcome is the same, which I think is again this conversation of like religion with Catholicism and like other, maybe not other religions, but sort of like all these different ideologies, and how in the end we're all gonna end up in the same place, maybe, or maybe we're gonna be in an endless cycle of living in the other land and being traded for someone else. Who knows? But yeah, I just think it opens up this really interesting conversation about time and space and parallel universes and gods. Sorry, my nose is so freaking itchy, and I'm so mad at Netflix for canceling it. I hope we can convince them to give it back, because first of all, we love a cast that is like ethnically diverse. We love, I'm not saying we, I love it. Me. Sorry, there is one more thing I want to talk about. There's just so much like visual energy in this show. There's so much to like point out with like the lighting and the colors. I was going to talk about how Bobby, we first see her in this red jacket and she's running around trying to hide, obviously not hiding very well because she's in a bright red jacket. And it's like, I think that red is very important. And so when I first saw her, when we first see her, we're like, okay, is it a ghost? Like who is this person running around the woods? And then we see her like looking at the image of Melody, and I immediately was convinced it was her mom. But then I kind of started questioning myself as the show went on. And I was like, oh, maybe she's a red herring. That's why she's wearing the red. But no, I think the red can mean a lot of things. It can be like her love and loss of her daughter, or like it could be a symbol of danger. You know, it could be so many things. And I feel like we're missing out on her character arc because of Netflix. Anyway, my last thing I want to talk about is the image of Kalego. Something I've always questioned is why we refer to God as a he, even though he's not like embodied, and that like we as an Eurocentric culture connect a gender with certain body parts. So I've never really understood why we call God he if he's not embodied. And in that same vein, why did they call Kalego a he if his body is essentially genderless? Like from what we can see of Kalego, there are no genitalia. However, so when I see that statue and the sort of weird like cowl or crown, and the way it's sitting, it reminds me of the Venus of Willendorf. Did I say that right? Which if you've ever seen Hellboy, it's that big statue of the very round lady, that's like sort of headless, or the head is very squirt. And then if you really look at it, there's this like slit down the center that kind of goes down the stomach and into the crotch area. And the image of blood to me always reminds me of like menstrual blood. And also all of the people who gave blood to the statue were women. So there's this very like feminine energy that's happening with this statue. So I'm wondering if I'm reading into that too much, or if there's something there. I don't know. What do you think? So yeah, this show was super captivating, very fascinating to watch. I kind of want to watch it again just to like look at the colors more and kind of like analyze things better. This was my first watching. These are my thoughts coming out of it. So I think it's super fascinating, and I hope that we can all bound together and convince Netflix to do a season 2, because Netflix is being so weird. if you compare it to their other big shows, like The Witcher, like I love the first season of The Witcher. And, you know, it stars white people. Yeah, there's people of color in it, but it stars white people. And they keep pushing it, even though they lost Henry Cavill, who's like the thing that made the show, because they completely destroyed it in season 2. And now they keep doing all these spin-offs, and people hate them. So I just don't understand, like, how can they be making money off of The Witcher? I guess they must be, and then they keep dropping all these other shows that are just honestly better. And again, there's that pattern of like the main characters being not white, or the main characters being queer, and then those shows going kind of so like, I don't know, maybe I'm just reading into it. There's been a lot of like really gross anti-queer legislation this year, so it could be them just trying to play the game and, I don't know, try not to be subversive. What do I know? I'm just a librarian. Go watch Archive 81. And if you want something with a sort of similar vibe, I would read... Yeah, so if you want something with a similar vibe, you can go read Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. It has the same sort of fungal energy. Sometimes I just say things. Anyway, thanks for watching. I had a great time. So